Hi, well, I think we'll begin. We've just been waiting for a few people to join the call. Um, I'm Alice Evett, and I want to thank you for joining us here for this second session in this climate ethics series put on by the Faculty of Philosophy, University of Oxford. This series is intended
Hi, well, I think we'll begin. We've just been waiting for a few people to join the call.
Just a moment.
I'm Alice Evett.
Sorry about that. This is the second session in this climate ethics series, which has brought together John Broome, which we've heard from last week, together with Megan Blomfield, which we have today. And in the future sessions, we'll have Shue and Simon Caney. The idea is to generate interest in climate ethics and demonstrate how philosophy can help us think about and tackle climate change and unite people across the university interested both in questions of climate and also in questions of philosophy. So I'm Alice Evett, and I'm a DPhil student at the University of Oxford in the philosophy faculty, and I'll be moderating this session. And joining us today is Dr. Megan Blomfield, who is a lecturer in political philosophy at University of Sheffield. And she's worked extensively on global justice, the environment, and normative dimensions of climate change, including distributions of emission shares. Last year, she published a book on global justice, natural resources, and climate change, which looked at the fair distribution of natural resources and how we can use ideas of distribution to better understand climate change and come up with just solutions. Today, she's going to be talking with us about her latest work, Climate Responsibilities in an Unjust World. What will happen is that the first 45 minutes to an hour will be her talk, her presentation, and then we'll go to questions from everyone on YouTube. So I really encourage you to write any questions you have in the live chat on YouTube. And yeah, over to you, Megan.
Great. Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you for organising this series. I really, really appreciate all the work you've put into it, and thanks for inviting me to be part of it. And thanks everyone that's listening. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Where are we? There. Okay. Right. So screen sharing is working. Like Alice said, this is pretty current work for me. It's a work in progress, although it's something that I've been thinking about for a really, really long time. I think trying to figure out the normative dimensions of climate change is actually really, really challenging. And it's definitely something that I'm still working to get my head around. So this talk is a kind of explanation of where I've gotten to so far with thinking about how we should understand climate change as a normative problem and what kind of responsibilities different groups or individuals have with respect to the problem of climate change. So the title of the talk is Climate Responsibilities in an Unjust World. The question that I'm going to be focusing on is who has a responsibility to try and do something to address the problem of climate change. And in particular, I'm going to argue that quite a lot of discussions that you get about this question in the philosophical literature, I think, miss some of the ways in which you can gain responsibility for having to deal with this problem. And in fact, when you look at the principles that philosophers are using and the underlying logic of these principles, actually, they suggest that these principles should have a kind of broader applicability than they often are taken to have, I think, in the literature as it stands. So as a brief outline, is it going to let me move? There we go. So as a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about, I'll start by explaining what I mean by climate responsibilities, and I'll introduce three principles that you commonly get in the philosophical literature, which are used by philosophers and also people more broadly, actually, to try and explain how we should think about responsibility, how we should allocate responsibilities or divide responsibilities for dealing with this problem. I'm then going to sort of zone in on one of these principles in particular, which is the polluter pays principle. And I'm going to try and sort of tease out what I'd call sort of the underlying logic of this principle. So why is it that polluters should pay? What's the kind of underlying argument for leading us to maybe think this way? And I'm going to suggest that really what the polluter pays principle is getting at is this idea that those who unjustly contribute to the problem of climate change have a special responsibility to do something about it. But this, I think, raises the broader question of, well, how exactly is it possible to be an unjust contributor to the problem of climate change? The polluter pays principle, as you can tell by the name, focuses on polluters as those who are the unjust contributors to the problem of climate change. But what I'm going to suggest is actually there are various ways in which you can be an unjust contributor to climate change, not just through your greenhouse gas emissions or your pollution. I'll then explain what this seems to imply in terms of how we should think about responsibilities for dealing with climate change. And if I have time, I'll also try to explain a kind of implication that I think this way of seeing the problem has for a common methodological debate that you get in the climate justice literature, in particular the debate about whether we should be isolationists or integrationists when we talk about climate justice. I'll explain what those terms mean if I get that far in the 45 minutes. Okay, so when I'm talking about climate responsibilities, what I mean to refer to are remedial responsibilities for climate change. A remedial responsibility for climate change can just roughly be understood as a special obligation to try and remedy this problem. So remedial remedy, that's the kind of easy way of thinking about it. If you have a remedial responsibility with respect to climate change, you have some kind of special obligation to try and do something to address it. And the problem with talking about climate responsibilities is that responsibility is really quite a slippery concept and gets used in lots of different ways in philosophy. And so this gets complicated straight away when we start to think about the ways in which you might have a remedial responsibility here. So often people try to ground remedial responsibilities for a problem in causal responsibility for the problem. So we might, right, so this is a problem focused approach, right? We're looking at a problem and asking who has a responsibility to try and deal with it. And one of the things we might do first is say, okay, well, who caused the problem? Maybe they're the people that should remedy it. So when we go that approach, we're grounding remedial responsibility in causal responsibility. But we don't always have to do it that way. We can alternatively try to ground remedial responsibility in other things. Another common one would be moral responsibility. So we might say, okay, when we're trying to figure out who should remedy this problem, let's find out who's to blame for the problem. And if we find who's to blame, maybe we'll say those are the ones that should remedy it. But on the other hand, remedial responsibility can come apart both from causation and from blame. Sometimes we just look to whoever has the best capacity to deal with the problem, and we say that they are remedially responsible for dealing with it. So an important thing to note about remedial responsibility, we can try to ground it in various different ways. We might be looking for those who caused the problem. We might be looking for those who are to blame for the problem, or we might just be looking for those who are best able to deal with it, or we might find another ground on which to base remedial responsibilities. And we can do all of these things in the climate change case as well. So what I'm talking about here is who has a special obligation to remedy the problem of climate change and why. And when we're talking about ways in which you can remedy the problem of climate change, generally the kind of things that you might be doing to try and address the problem get split into three categories. So one thing you can do is try to mitigate the problem. That means you try to reduce the progress of climate change, basically mainly by stopping greenhouse gases being dumped into the atmosphere. Another thing you can try and do to address the problem of climate change is help communities adapt. Communities and other groups adapt to the problems, the climate events that you don't succeed in preventing through mitigation. So you help them become more resilient to climate events, for example, or develop other ways of coping with climate events that don't lead to so much harm. And then a third thing that you might do to address the problem of climate change is compensate. So where mitigation and adaptation doesn't succeed in preventing things of value being destroyed or people being harmed, the question arises, who has an obligation to remedy the problem through compensating those who have been harmed? Okay, so this is the question that I'm going to focus on. Who has a special obligation or a remedial responsibility to redress climate change through things such as mitigation, adaptation, and compensation? And why do they have these responsibilities? And in analytic philosophy, there are three kind of main approaches that you get to answering this question, and they basically refer to principles that we could use to assign responsibilities. The first one is the polluter pays principle. So this says you have a special obligation to remedy climate change if you're a polluter. And the thinking behind this principle, roughly speaking, is that polluters are those that have caused the problem. So the problem. So this is a kind of attempt to ground remedial responsibility and causal responsibility. Another principle that gets referred to is the beneficiary pays principle. According to beneficiary pays, we go to those who have benefited from activities that cause climate change, and we say that they are the people that have a remedial responsibility with respect to the problem. And so we'd be thinking of sort of, people who have benefited financially or in other ways from activities that dump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And the rough thinking behind this principle is that if you are benefiting from an activity that is causing a problem or harming other people, we might conclude that through that benefit, you gain a special obligation to remedy the problem that it has caused for other people. The third principle that often gets referred to is the ability to pay principle. So on this approach, we basically just say those who have a remedial obligation to deal with the problem of climate change are those with the best capacity, or the wealthy, or those who in some sense have the greatest ability to confront this problem. And some philosophers just defend one of these principles over the others. Some defend a combination of these principles, some defend other principles, but these tend to be three that come up a lot. And when these principles are introduced, you can kind of tell a story about how you might work through each one. So often people start with the polluter pays principle because it seems to have this intuitive appeal, right? That when we're thinking about who should remedy a problem like climate change, we start off by looking for those who've caused it, and we ask if they have a special obligation to deal with it. The polluter pays principle faces various problems. One of the problems that people think it might have is that lots of polluters aren't around anymore. So when we're thinking about the problem of climate change, right, the climate is changing due to emissions that have been dumped in the atmosphere, at least since the time of the Industrial Revolution. So it seems quite likely that a lot of polluters are not around anymore. And then the question is obviously going to arise, well, who is there someone that has an obligation to pay the cost of this pollution? You can't go to the polluters in this case, they're not here anymore, they haven't been here for a long time. It's sometimes at this point that people then bring up the beneficiary pays principle as something we could use that could sort of step in to deal with this problem. So maybe even if polluters aren't around anymore, we can look at where the benefits of those polluting activities have gone. We can trace the money, so to speak, find out who now has those benefits, and then we ask the question of whether they have gained a kind of special obligation for dealing with this problem that past polluters caused, they benefited from, and someone else is being harmed by. The beneficiary pays principle also faces some challenges. So one of the kind of biggest ones is you need to explain what it is about benefiting from what somebody else has done that gives you a special obligation for dealing with the problem that they created, that you didn't yourself create. And so at this stage, if you think that the problems for the polluter pays principle and the beneficiary pays principle mean that either these principles don't work at all, or that they only have a kind of limited applicability, sometimes then the ability to pay principle gets called up on to say, okay, well, if we can't divide up all the costs of climate change, or all of the burdens of climate change, or all of the responsibilities using the PPP and the BPP, maybe then whatever is left over will just share out on the basis of ability to pay. An ability to pay might seem like a good approach, right? Because it seems relatively practical. You're going to those who can deal with the problem. We might also think it's just fair when you're dealing with a collective problem that those with the most ability should pay most of the costs. Or you might think it's quite appealing because if we get the wealthiest to pay, we're also going to make progress in terms of other problems like global inequality. So these are the sort of the three main principles that tend to be brought up as possibilities for assigning remedial responsibility for dealing with the problem of climate change. And I'm going to zone in on the polluter pays principle. So as I said, the polluter pays principle, roughly speaking, is trying to ground remedial responsibility in causal responsibility. And it has this kind of intuitive appeal on that basis. It seems kind of common sense that when we're thinking about who should deal with a problem, we would first of all go to those who caused it. It has sort of this background idea of cleaning up your own mess. And you can give examples where it seems like a good way of thinking about how we should deal with environmental problems. So if a company dumps toxic waste into a community's drinking water, it might seem really obvious that it's that particular company that caused the pollution of the drinking water that should pay to clean up the mess and pay any of the resulting costs and compensate the affected community. In the climate change case, the PPP is a little bit more difficult to apply than in that sort of straightforward case where there's a single polluter, like a company or an agent, that has harmed somebody else. One of the reasons for this is that obviously there isn't a single polluter in the climate change case. This is a case of collective causation on an absolutely massive scale. The climate change that we're experiencing now and that we're seeing now is a result of the cumulative emissions of people across like hundreds of years, because at least in the case of CO2, once you dump it in the atmosphere, it stays there for a really, really long time and it just accumulates. So really we're talking about a problem where there are lots, it seems like there are lots and lots of polluters, but there's also a question of whether everybody who's dumped emissions into the atmosphere should count as a polluter in the first place. So it's often suggested that it's not so much a problem that people have emitted at all, but that they have emitted too much, and that there wouldn't have been such a problem if emissions had remained at a relatively low level, right? It's often suggested there was a kind of safe budget of global greenhouse gas emissions, such that if only humanity's collective emissions had stayed within that safe budget, sure, we would have seen some increase in atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, but not to such an extent that we would have had the sort of dangerous changes in the climate occur that we're seeing now. So that kind of suggests that it would be possible to emit without even kind of being a polluter, in the sense that the emissions have contributed to a problem, if emissions had stayed sufficiently low. And a way to get around these and some other problems for the polluter pays principle is usually that polluters get classed not as just anyone who emits, but excessive emitters. So what makes you a polluter in this case is that you emit excessively, where being an excessive emitter is generally read as having exceeded your fair share of the safe amount. So the idea is if everyone had stayed within this kind of safe amount of emissions and only used their fair share of the safe amount of emissions, we wouldn't have this problem that we're now seeing. So it's those who have exceeded this sort of fair, safe share that are the ones that count as polluters. And that's what kind of gets you on the hook for having remedial responsibilities for dealing with climate change. It's not just that you emitted, it's that you emitted too much. And this has the kind of appealing consequence that people who have just been emitting to survive or who have had very low levels of emissions are not going to count as polluters who have a special obligation for dealing with this problem. It's those who have emitted excessively. So I think what this kind of reveals about the polluter pays principle is that what kind of underwrites this approach, its underlying logic, so to speak, is that it seeks to ground remedial responsibility for climate change in unjust contribution to the problem. So we're looking for those who have contributed to the problem in a way that is in some sense unjust, where what this boils down to usually is that to be a contributor is to be an emitter, and what makes you an unjust contributor is that you emitted excessively. Perhaps that you knowingly emitted excessively as well. There's a big debate about whether it's possible to have, well, whether some people are responsible because they emitted excessively without knowing they were doing so. So if you think back in time to when people didn't know about the problem of climate change, there's been quite a lot of debate about whether high emitters, before they knew the problem they were contributing to, should also have remedial responsibility for dealing with it or not. But the underlying kind of the idea here is you get a special obligation for dealing with the problem of climate change because through your excessive emissions, you have made an unjust contribution to the problem. Okay. So I think one of the reasons that this principle is, again, quite appealing, not just that it's intuitive or kind of has this common sense idea of cleaning up your own mess, is that it holds out also some hope that we could get quite a neat division of responsibility for dealing with climate change if we go down this route. So I think what some people have in mind is that if we can calculate the cost of dealing with climate change, right, how much are we going to have to pay? And then scientists can look at the historical emissions record and see, right, how many greenhouse gases have been dumped into the atmosphere. We can then try and figure out, right, who dumped those emissions there. We attribute all of these emissions to those who have dumped them, who are responsible for them. Figure out who amongst those emitters have emitted excessively. We can do all of this in a metric like tons of CO2 equivalent. That means that we can see, like, maybe this agent over here emitted twice as much as this agent over here. We can have this kind of spreadsheet of who emitted and how much in this nice comparable metric, and then we can divvy up the cost of dealing with climate change accordingly. So we can kind of quite neatly monetize responsibilities on this approach, I think, is part of the hope. So we get quite a nice division of responsibility if we do this. If we can divvy up emissions, we can map the costs that now have to be paid onto those emission shares or those excessive emission shares. There are some remaining challenges. So actually, this process of attributing emissions to different parties is going to be quite difficult. It's not as if emissions are kind of dug out of the ground and burnt by single agents. Emissions derive from very, very complex supply chains and social processes and practices that involve lots of different agents. So there's big questions that have to be answered about exactly who is responsible, which agents along the supply chain are responsible for the emissions, right? Do we go to producers, consumers, somebody else? So that's going to take quite a bit of work. Another challenge is defining what counts as excessive. I think some cases of excessive emissions are fairly easy to identify. So, right, corporations and states who, even knowing about climate change, have continued to emit massively, avoidably, without any kind of excuse for what they're doing, I think will definitely count as polluters who have a special obligation to deal with the problem. Some people try to define excessive in terms of equal per capita shares. Instead, they say, well, what a fair share of the safe amount would have been an equal per capita one. And then we just look, an excessive emitter is anyone who emitted more than an equal share of the safe amount. But we're going to have to plug something in here, right, to explain what it is that makes you not just an emitter, but an excessive emitter, and therefore a polluter that needs to pay some of these costs. So hopefully that's enough background on the kind of the question that I'm looking at, and also the way that some people try to answer this question of who has a remedial responsibility with respect to climate change. How do special obligations for dealing with this problem, how are they acquired? And in particular, the kind of polluter pays approach, which says you gain a special responsibility with respect to dealing with this problem by being an unjust contributor to it. But what the polluter pays principle focuses on in particular is that you are an unjust contributor when you're an excessive emitter. So in order to kind of motivate what I'm going to talk about now and my own thinking about this, I'll try and sort of explain how I ended up with this line of thinking. So looking at the PPP and the way people were using it and thinking about whether it works or not, and in which cases it works and maybe which cases it doesn't, and in particular whether it works for historical emissions, so emissions that took place before people really knew about the problem of climate change. It seemed to me that it's not so much that the approach is misguided, right? It does totally make sense when we're trying to think about who should deal with the problem of climate change to look to those who have contributed to the problem. But that the PPP itself seems to take a kind of a slightly, it only looks at part of the picture really of who has contributed to the problem of climate change. Because it focuses so much on greenhouse gas emissions. Sometimes people also talk about deforestation as a contributor to atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases, but in general, the focus is on like who can we hold responsible for having contributed to this atmospheric increase in greenhouse gases, and that's the sole focus. So we take these obvious causal contributions to the problem, we try to determine which are unjust. And sometimes that involves looking back through the whole historical record of emissions and trying to figure out, right, did someone commit an injustice here, even maybe 100 years ago, by emitting excessively, emitting more than their fair share, emitting more than an equal per capita share? And some of those questions start to look a bit weird, I think. So this idea that you might have emitted excessively without knowing that you were emitting excessively, without knowing that there is this kind of safe budget of emissions, or that climate change is even a problem that you should be concerned about. And you can see why you would end up asking these questions if your focus, if you're thinking of contributors just as being emitters, your focus is going to be on the historical emissions record. You're going to be trying to figure out, well, which of these contributions were unjust? And maybe doing something like plugging in an equal per capita shares principle in order to identify injustice in the historical emissions record. But given that we live in a world that is full of injustices, it just seemed to me that another approach would be, rather than just focusing on the historical emissions record and trying to identify injustice in it, look at all the obvious injustices that characterize our world, indisputable injustices that characterize our world, and ask, well, which of these are contributing to the problem of climate change, right? So instead of starting with what I think seem to be the most obvious causal contributions, right? When we think about the causes of climate change, we largely think about emissions. So starting there and asking, well, which of these obvious causal contributions are unjust? Why not start with the obvious injustices by which our world is largely characterized and say, well, which of these are contributing to the problem of climate change? So that's what I'm going to try and kind of do. So we live in an unjust world. This is obvious and indisputable, I think, right? We live in a world that is characterized by severe poverty, by radical social, economic, and political inequalities, political oppression, marginalization, political domination, discrimination, right? And this is not a solely current problem either. Our world has been characterized by injustice throughout history, significantly characterized by various injustices like imperialism, colonialism, wars, economic exploitation, and lots of these historical injustices, nobody has ever even made an attempt to rectify them, and they continue to have a big effect on the way things work today. So starting from this premise, right, that our world is characterized significantly by injustice, and then asking, well, which of these injustices contribute to the problem of climate change? It seems to me that quite a lot of them do. And some of them will contribute by the emissions pathway, right? One of the reasons why emissions have remained so high is that we live in a world that is characterized significantly by political injustices, which means that certain states and corporations are able to resist controls being put on emissions rates, right? And resist workable agreements and policies on climate change being put in place, often by means such as misinformation or political lobbying or straight out financial manipulation, right? So these are all ways in which injustices have contributed to emissions rates being high, right? But there are also ways, I think, that injustices contribute to climate change, not through enhancing greenhouse gas emissions, not through facilitating the dumping of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because there are other sort of causal pathways via which human agency contributes to the problem of climate change. It isn't actually just through facilitating emissions ending up in the atmosphere. And I think this point can be easier to recognize if we switch from thinking about remedial responsibility for climate change to thinking about remedial responsibility when it comes to what are thought of as natural disasters, right? So if we think about natural disasters, so something like an earthquake or a volcanic eruption, let's say, and we ask the same question, right? Who has a special obligation to remedy problems like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, other natural disasters, right, that are not human caused, so that differ from climate change in the fact that they are not anthropogenic, right? One very significant thing about climate change is that it is resulting from human activities. And that does make a difference to how we should think about it. But to simplify things for now, let's focus instead on natural disasters, right, that are not human caused. And ask the question again, who has remedial responsibilities here to maybe try and mitigate natural disasters, help communities adapt to them, or maybe compensate communities that are harmed by them? If we were going to go through the same process as seems to be used in the climate change case, right? It seems like we would reason this way, okay? We might start with something like the polluter pays principle and say, okay, well, who is there like an analogous agent to the polluter in the climate change case who caused this disastrous event to happen? And the answer is no in this case, right? Because we're talking about a natural event that has not been caused by human activity. We're not talking about like an earthquake that's been triggered by some mining operation. We're talking about a geological event. So the polluter pays principle doesn't seem to help us in the same way in this case, right? In the climate change case, we have emitters. In this natural disaster case, we don't have a kind of equivalent party. So it doesn't seem like we can use the polluter pays principle to assign responsibility here. We then might move on to the beneficiary pays principle, but again, this isn't going to get us very far. The way the beneficiary pays principle works in the climate case is that the way it's used is that you look for actions that have caused climate change, and then you find out where the benefits of those actions have gone. And you say, well, maybe by benefiting, you have a remedial responsibility here. You can't do that in this natural disasters case either, right? Because we're talking about events that were not caused by human action. So there isn't an equivalent party to the beneficiary in the climate change case here either. So it seems like we end up with the ability to pay principle, and the answer is just going to be, okay, well, the way in which we figure out how to assign special obligations for dealing with the consequences of natural disasters, we just look at those with the ability, the resources, the capacity. But it seems to me like this isn't a very good answer in the natural disaster case, and often not what we would really think about who has a special obligation to deal with, to respond to natural disasters. Often if we think about who might have a special responsibility to address these sort of problems, we might say something like, okay, well, is there someone that has, first of all, a special responsibility to protect the community in question? But we might also say, well, recognizing that the same natural event will have a very, very different effect in terms of how devastating its impacts are, depending on the social situation that it interacts with, right? An earthquake in a place that has earthquake resilient infrastructure and plenty of resources to spend on early warning systems, making sure that stuff is earthquake safe, making sure that people are insured for any consequences that might happen, as opposed to an earthquake that takes place in a community that is lacking in resources, does not have resilient infrastructure, does not have the capacity to put in an early warning system. This very same natural event would have a completely different impact in terms of how disastrous it is for the community in question. And this seems to raise the possibility that in the case of natural events, one way in which you can gain remedial responsibilities is by being responsible for the fact that the social situation that that natural event interacts with is one that has left communities very, very vulnerable to being harmed by natural events. So it seems to me in the case of natural disasters, it's not so obvious that the only way you get a remedial responsibility for dealing with them would be through some kind of capacity-based principle. It seems to me pretty clear that you could also have a special responsibility here because you're responsible for the community that is hit by a natural disaster being so vulnerable to experiencing a disaster as a result. So the idea I'm getting at here is human agency can affect the way that communities experience natural disasters, either by leaving them less protected than they should be, or by leaving them so that they don't have the resources to cope with those natural disasters. So the question then is, if in the case of natural disasters, we think that actually remedial responsibility can be gained in these ways, right? You can have a remedial responsibility because you are responsible for the community in question being so vulnerable to experiencing catastrophic effects when those natural disasters hit. If we switch back now to thinking about climate change, right, anthropogenic climate events, do those remedial responsibilities that some parties have because they left communities vulnerable to experiencing disasters, do they go out the window and now we just focus on the contribution that you make through emitting greenhouse gases, or do those remedial responsibilities that can be gained through your contribution to the underlying social situation remain in the picture or not? And I want to argue that they remain in the picture, right? Bringing emissions in and recognizing that you can contribute through emitting doesn't get rid of the fact that you can also contribute through leaving communities vulnerable. And many of the ways in which agents or groups or individuals have contributed to leaving communities vulnerable are unjust. So according to the logic of the polluter pays principle should also mean that you have remedial responsibilities here. So I'll try to make that a little bit clearer with the help of this graphic from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the main bit to focus on in this graphic is just the central Venn diagram. What this Venn diagram is showing is that when communities are at risk of disaster because of climate change, this isn't just the result of the weather and climate events that are going to increase in their severity I've lost the word. This isn't just because of the weather and climate events that are going to result from climate change, right? The hurricanes, the floods, the sea level rise, and other climate impacts that are going to result because the climate is changing. Those things are part of why communities are facing disaster risk, but they're not the whole story. What this diagram shows is that to be at risk of disaster, you not only need to be having these weather and climate events happening, but you also need to be, first of all, exposed, right? This is the exposure driver, which basically just means you need to be in a place that will be impacted by them, right? Sea level rise is not going to put you at disaster risk if you aren't located in a place that will be impacted by sea level rise. You need to be exposed to these weather and climate events in order for them to put you at risk. That's what the kind of the exposure oval is saying. But then you also need to be affected by this third driver, vulnerability. Vulnerability is basically a measure of your propensity to suffer bad consequences when you are hit by climate events. So what this Venn diagram is showing is that to be at risk of disaster because of climate change, it's not just enough that these climate events are being caused by the changes that we're experiencing in our climate. For something of value or a community to be at disaster risk, it also needs to be exposed to these climate events and vulnerable to suffering bad effects when it's hit by them. Vulnerability as a factor is basically getting at the idea that even if you're exposed to weather and climate events, if you have enough resources to move out the way, protect your property, buy insurance, or like build a seawall or whatever, then even being hit by these climate events is not going to be a disaster for you, because you have the resources to deal with it. Vulnerability is largely an issue with lacking resources to be able to cope with the weather and climate events that you're hit by. So like what this graphic shows, I think, is that the way the polluter pays principle is used a lot at the moment is it's used to try and identify unjust contributions to the weather and climate events side of the problem by looking for those who have emitted excessively and count as unjust contributors on that basis, when actually we should also be looking at the vulnerability and exposure side and asking, okay, well, are there other ways, right? Human agency is going to come in the picture here as well. How has human agency contributed to enhancing exposure to weather and climate events? How has it contributed to enhancing vulnerability to weather and climate events? And are some of those contributions also unjust, right? And therefore the sort of thing that would ground remedial responsibilities for dealing with the problem. And the question about whether they're unjust is going to be really important, right? So there'll be lots of ways that people might have contributed to stuff like exposure that were completely innocent, right? You know, you with the best information you had at the time, you decided to build your community by the sea, not having any idea and not being able to have any idea that what was going to happen later down the line is sea level rise. But in other cases, contributions to exposure and vulnerability are not going to be so innocent. And then we're faced with the question of whether those ways of contributing ground remedial responsibilities. But the key thing to take away from this picture, right, is that we shouldn't just be thinking about contributions and unjust contributions to weather and climate events by focusing just on emissions. If what we're interested in is unjust contribution to the problem, right, and the problem of climate change is the fact that it places things that are of value, communities, and other things that are of value at risk of disaster, we also should be asking about contributions to vulnerability and exposure, because it's only when the three of these are in the picture that this risk of disaster is really an issue. The IPCC even goes as far as to say that climate change is not a risk per se. Climate change is not a risk in itself. Climate change is a risk because of the underlying social situation that it interacts with. And so when we're thinking about responsibility for the problem, what I'm saying is we shouldn't just be thinking about contributions to those climate events. We also need to be asking, well, who contributed to making certain communities or things of value particularly exposed to these events and particularly vulnerable to them, and did they do so in ways that are unjust? Okay, so I think and I'm only going to be able to explain this briefly, so that's the main thing, right, that I want to kind of convince people of, that we should be shifting our focus not just from looking at the way that emitters contribute, but other ways in which human agency has contributed to the problem through the pathways of vulnerability and exposure. But in brief, some reasons for thinking that there are going to be unjust contributions here. So vulnerability, high vulnerability to climate change, largely results, as I said, from lack of resources. So if you are suffering from poverty, if you don't have money to fall back on, if you don't have resilient infrastructure, if you don't have a government that will reliably assist you in dealing with climate events, if you are suffering from environmental degradation, which might itself be as a result of fossil fuel extraction, right? If you are living under overburdened or dysfunctional institutions, if you're marginalized from environmental decision-making that affects you, or if you're being negatively impacted by international financial pressures, all of these are things that will enhance the vulnerability of communities to climate impacts. And I think it's not going to take an awful lot of work to show that a lot of these things derive from unjust practices, right? The reason that some communities are afflicted by poverty is not just bad luck, it's a result of injustice. The reason we live in a world where so many communities are struggling with these issues is that it is a world that has been created by injustice, a world that has been deeply, deeply shaped by things like colonialism and war, and that these problems that have nobody has attempted to rectify them. this is one of the reasons why so many human communities are highly vulnerable to climate change now. Exposure might be less, there might be fewer cases where it's obvious that injustice has contributed to exposure, I think. So like I said, a lot of the reasons communities have ended up in cases that are more exposed to climate events do just seem to be kind of bad luck, right? It was a good place to live at the time, but in a climate changed world, it's not going to be such a good place to live. But I think there will be cases where it seems like human agency has contributed to exposure in ways that are unjust and that therefore look likely to ground remedial responsibilities. And I think one example of this is demonstrated really nicely by this quote from a paper by Wiley Carr and Christopher Preston, where they conducted an interview with an anonymous Alaska native who was talking about what they thought of the effects that climate change was having on their communities, which in Alaska are kind of, they're sometimes described as one of the places that is on the front line of climate change, right? These are places where people are already being impacted by climate change to such an extent that they might not be able to live there for very much longer. And the interviewee put it this way, so to quote, 85% of our communities here are coastal communities, and people really are having to consider moving their communities. A lot of these villages and their location where they're at now, they're in those particular areas, not of their own choosing. The Bureau of Indian Affairs located them because they're on navigable waters. It was easy to barge freight and other stuff into those communities. Our communities were either nomadic or semi-nomadic, moved depending on seasons, on whatever food sources were available. Living by the water is not one of the things that we would probably have chosen for a lifetime commitment, because we recognise that there are issues that are bound to happen. The problem is no one accepts the responsibility for having located these communities in the areas that they now find themselves in, right? So I think like this is getting at the what I think is something we should be asking as well. Is someone responsible for the fact that some communities are highly exposed to climate events? Like the person in this interview is suggesting that we do need to ask this question, right? Someone should accept responsibility in this case for the fact that these people have been, first of all, forced to sedentarize, but also forced to sedentarize in an area that is now on the front lines of climate change. So again, and you find other stories about this as well, about how lots of coastal communities did not originally end up on the coast through their own choosing, but were cited there by colonial authorities for various practical reasons. And I think in these cases as well, we get this question, well, is there somebody around now that has gained a special responsibility for dealing with the problem that these communities are facing because they unjustly contributed to their exposure by forcing them into locations that they didn't actually want to live in? Okay, so what I've been arguing then is that if we are grounding remedial responsibility and unjust contribution to the problem, right, if this is really this underlying logic of the polluter pays principle, if it's sound, we shouldn't just be asking what seems to be the PPP question, right? Which contributions to increased atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations are unjust? We should also be asking which contributions to vulnerability and exposure are unjust, because otherwise we're only considering responsibility for part of the problem, right? Sure, emissions are what are causing the climate to change. But like the IPCC says, right, climate change is not the risk on its own. The risk arises because climate change interacts with an underlying social situation in order to produce harm. And that means that you can contribute to the normative problem of climate change, not just through emitting greenhouse gases and causing those physical climate changes, but also through contributing to the exposure and vulnerability that human communities possess in the face of climate change. And if you contribute unjustly to this underlying social situation, then the same logic seems to apply here as well, right? You also gain a remedial responsibility for dealing with the problem. And I think that if we ignore that there is this other pathway by which people have contributed to climate change as a problem of global justice, we're only looking at part of the issue. And missing out on the fact that climate change in a world that is unjust like our own is just a very, very different problem than climate change would have been if it was taking place in a world that was otherwise just, right? If climate change was taking place in a world that wasn't afflicted by these many, many other injustices, it would have been a completely different problem to be dealing with. So if we want to understand the problem of climate change, we need to be taking into account the social situation that it interacts with, and the many ways in which various parties have contributed to that social situation being one of high vulnerability and exposure for a lot of human communities. And I think that's 45 minutes, so I'm going to have to stop there and not get onto the integrationism, isolationism debate. I'll have to leave that for another day. But thank you very, very much, everybody, for listening, and thank you, Alice. I guess now is the Q&A.
Megan, thank you so much for that talk. Can I ask you to stop sharing your screen? Yes. Can I just remind everyone watching to please post any questions you have in the chat on the YouTube live stream, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. But Megan, I wanted to say, I thought the focus you had, shifting everything away from just greenhouse gas emissions, which really is the dominates the literature on climate ethics. It's all about emissions, who emitted, and looking at it through those three principles, as you said. But this approach, looking at you might say the other side, the reverse, all the vulnerabilities, is really fascinating. And you're right, it not only extends to where people are living, but issues like healthcare, buildings and infrastructure. Climate change is going to bring about extreme health issues and risk of heat stroke. And if people, for example, in America don't have access to healthcare, that's going to be a real problem, and really escalate the climate damage and harm that's going to happen. So maybe the first question I might ask is, so if you're talking, you mentioned with your example with coastal communities, how a lot of people are living in areas as a result of issues like colonialism and things that were out of their own choice and control. It seems like this will again run into problems with historical responsibility. So colonialism and the decisions that were made that forced them to live in coastal areas or other areas took place a long time ago. And now those people are not around to face the consequences of that. So what, in cases where that kind of historical element comes in, what would you say is the best way to deal with that on this approach?
Yeah, so this approach, it does, so you don't necessarily, I am tying these questions of climate justice to questions about historical injustice and to historical injustices like colonialism. You wouldn't necessarily have, like, if you're kind of skeptical about reparations claims, you wouldn't necessarily have to go that approach. You could just instead think of it as, well, maybe there would be more present day cases of communities having their exposure enhanced, right? People are still being moved off their land in lots of different places and moved into areas that are more exposed to various problems and climate events. So if you're skeptical about reparations claims, I think there will still be present day cases where perpetrators are still around that would be picked up by this approach. I think reparations claims are really, really important, but difficult. And so one of the things that just remains to do is a lot of work in figuring out where reparations claims succeed and what exactly they succeed in showing, and then how this ties into debates about what we should do about climate change now. But you get a similar kind of problem with the polluter pays principle as well, right? So if you want to apply the polluter pays principle going back through time, one option is to go the collective route and say, look, polluters include parties like corporations and states that even if the pollution happened a while ago, they as the contributors are still around and we can still ask them to pay. You can do something similar in the colonialism case, right? Although a lot of the people involved are not around anymore, these are wrongs that were perpetrated by states and other organizations, many of which are still around and could still be asked to pay. Or if you are skeptical about those kinds of collective responsibility claims, then you can go the beneficiary pays route and say, look, we might be talking about injustices that were committed a long time ago, but there are still people benefiting in the present. And if you're benefiting in the present from colonial practices that have continued to leave people vulnerable to climate change in the present, I think we can still ask whether you thereby gain a special responsibility to do something about climate change because you have benefited from a historical injustice that has left other people more vulnerable to climate change's impacts.
That's great. So I'm just trying to get through as many questions as possible. So what I'll do is I'll just jump on to the next question as they appear. No, not at all. And so that you can see the questions, I'll make sure to post them in the chat as well. This next question comes from Thomas Sinclair.
Okay.
So he says, it seems to me that there are two different things going on in your paper. One is distinguishing two kinds of causal contribution, emissions contributions and vulnerability contributions. The other is deriving principles for assigning remedial responsibility for climate change by principles for assigning responsibility for other kinds of injustice. Might the risk of the second strand be that you effectively rule out the possibility of unjust contributions to climate change that aren't also instantiations of some other wrong?
So I'll do my best to answer that question. I don't know if I totally understand it. So I would want to leave open the possibility that there are many ways in which contributions to climate change should be deemed unjust. I think all I'm trying to get at here is that if we're sympathetic to the idea behind the polluter pays principle, right, we're trying to ground remedial responsibility in contribution to the problem, but we also want to distinguish between contributions that where it doesn't seem fair to say that you have a remedial responsibility purely because you contributed, right? Maybe you didn't know any better, maybe you didn't have any alternatives, maybe you contributed unwillingly or because it was your only way of surviving. In those cases, contribution to the problem doesn't seem like the sort of thing that should ground remedial responsibility. So the just unjust distinction is just trying to get at, well, in what cases is contributing the kind of thing that should get you on the hook for remedial responsibility, and in what cases is it not? And I don't, so in the polluter pays case, it's that you emitted excessively. And the cases I'm talking about is that you contributed in some other way that is faulty, right? And it might not be that you knew that you were contributing to the problem of climate change, that there's still something else about your contribution that meant you should be held liable in some sense for some of the consequences that arose from it. So I would hope I'm not ruling out the possibility of unjust contributions to climate change that aren't also instantiations of some other wrong. I think it would leave it open for there to be various different ways of unjustly contributing to climate change. And I'm just trying to focus on some of the kind of most indisputable wrongs that have contributed to this problem.
So the next question we've got here is in regards to disaster risk. So you might use disaster risk as a measure of the effects on people. And is that just disasters now? What about the long-term risk, such as in a decade's time, making areas uninhabitable for everyone. Does this way of thinking help with more universal risks?
So I think disaster risk, so it's supposed to be a measure that you can use in the long term, right? We can ask what disaster risk a community is facing now, in terms of which climate events it's exposed to and what its level of vulnerability is. And we can also ask about what level of disaster risk a community will face in an imagined future, where, and the IPCC is trying to do this, right? In an imagined future, depending on how things have developed, both socioeconomically and in terms of the physical climate change that communities are being subjected to. So it isn't just disasters now. It's supposed to be getting at. The idea is what disaster risk, we can use disaster risk to think about the risk that communities are at, both now and in different kind of futures that we could try and pursue through our climate policies, but also socioeconomic policies that could be aimed at reducing vulnerability and exposure.
Right, so next question. You say that the polluter pays principle is based on injustice. Perhaps we should interpret motivations differently. It could be that that to incentivize action, people should face costs of their actions, or B, that legal responsibilities look more like the polluter pays principle. I'll just have a message to people. I have to apologize if I'm missing some of the ends of people's questions. There's quite a few posts that take up multiple sections. So do bear with me if I miss the tail end of your question. I'm trying my best to find it.
Okay, so yeah, I guess you could try and defend the polluter pays principle in different ways. I think what's going on when people try to plug in these fair shares principles is that they're getting at this idea of unjust contribution to the problem. I guess you could have a forward-looking PPP that just says, well, we get, maybe you say it's not even that the contribution is unjust, it's just if we get people to pay the cost of their pollution, that will have a good outcome in terms of disincentivizing pollution. But then I guess you could run the same thing with contributions to exposure and vulnerability, right? Those who continue through practices like economic exploitation or environmental degradation to enhance the vulnerability of communities, even if you don't think their actions are unjust, maybe you just think they're inevitable economic practices, we would still want to assign responsibilities to those actors in order to discourage them from what they're doing. So I think you could probably still, if you wanted to motivate the PPP that way, you could still carry that reasoning over to contributions to vulnerability and exposure as well. I'm not sure about the legal responsibilities point, I'm afraid. I'm not sure why legal responsibilities look more like the PPP.
Great, so next question. If I understand you correctly, you're trying to introduce a new responsibility pathway through the idea of exposure and vulnerability. However, can't the failure to fulfill the responsibility of preventing communities from being in a state of vulnerability and exposure from natural disasters be tracked in terms of the polluter pays principle and the beneficiary pays principle? Can't we say that there are special obligations to remedy if a state that did not prepare the community reflective of the polluter pays principle because it aggravated the consequences of the disaster, or if there are developers who cut corners for profit by not observing building codes and aggravated the consequences of the earthquake?
Okay, so I think maybe I just agree with the person that's asking this question. So my claim is not that the PPP and the BPP don't work at all. My claim is that what seems to me to be the underlying logic of these principles entails that they should be applied in a broader sense than they are at the moment. And in fact, in implying them in that broader sense, polluter pays begins to be a bit of a misleading way of referring to the principle, because when we think of polluters, I think we are led to think of people who are emitting greenhouse gases, right? Contributing to a community's vulnerability by lumping it with unpayable debts, or exploiting it economically, or degrading their environment, or waging war on them, they don't look like acts of pollution, right? But they are ways of unjustly contributing to vulnerability to climate change. So if that's the kind of the underlying reasoning we have for supporting the PPP in the first place, then those things should also be sources of remedial responsibility. And similarly, I didn't manage to get to this part of the talk, but those who have benefited from these unjust contributions to vulnerability and exposure, we can also ask, well, through benefiting, I guess, for example, developers who saved money by not observing building codes and leaving people more vulnerable to, I don't know, climate change induced flooding, or hurricanes or cyclones. They're both causal contributors and beneficiaries, right? Again, if we follow the underlying logic that what we're looking for when assigning remedial responsibility is who contributed, did they do so in a way that we can hold them accountable for? Or did someone benefit in a way that we think could ground remedial responsibility? Then, so my claim is that we should be asking these questions, and that the problem is not with the rationale behind the PPP and the BPP, it's with the restricted focus that I think you get a lot on emissions and benefits from activities that release emissions. So I'm not defending a rejection of them. I'm just saying that we should go with the underlying logic instead of the way they're being applied at the moment, and broaden out in the ways that I think this questioner is actually kind of suggesting, which I would agree with.
Great. So next one, focusing on emissions gives us a clear case for thinking about intergenerational justice, since future generations can't undo the emissions of their predecessors. But if we focus on unjust social structures that contribute to climate change impact, what implications might this have for how we think about obligations to future generations?
So I guess I don't see the distinction here again. So if emissions give us a clear case for thinking about intergenerational justice, well, for one thing, we might think future generations can, in a sense, undo the emissions of their predecessors. And unfortunately, people are talking about this as a way of dealing with climate change at the moment. The idea of carbon dioxide removal would be that instead of reducing emissions now, we leave people in the future, or start developing technologies so that people in the future can suck greenhouse gases back out of the air, which is a technology that hasn't been proven on scale and is an absolutely disastrous thing to be counting on for dealing with the problem of climate change. So I don't think there is the distinction that this question is getting at, between the idea that emissions are a clear case of intergenerational injustice because there's something that previous generations do that then later generations can't undo and have to deal with. I think the same thing is the case with unjust social structures. Lots of unjust social structures have persisted over a really long period of time and were created by people that aren't around anymore, and it is really difficult to undo them. But some people were responsible for contributing to them, and some people have benefited from them while other people are being harmed from them. So in the same way as emissions, I think they can ground remedial responsibilities for dealing with climate change when they make it a more difficult problem to deal with, in which some people are at much higher risk than others.
Right, so Do you think that someone who could inform these communities but fails to do so has a remedial responsibility insofar as they increase the vulnerability of the community by not making them aware and reactive? If so, many more people may get or may have responsibility than if we focus on economic and political actors.
So what you'd have to try and figure out in order to answer that question is, first of all, whether we want to count that as a causal contribution. And then, so one of the difficulties here is that figuring out what counts as a causal contribution can get you into very difficult philosophical territory. Some contributions seem obvious, other ones are harder, right? Can you contribute to a problem because you could have done something about it, but you didn't? Which is what this question is kind of getting at. So first of all, we want to ask, well, does that really count as contributing? Then we need to ask, well, does that count as an unjust contribution? So it's going to depend on some kind of background theory of whether this particular agent had a responsibility to go and decrease the vulnerability of the community. And we'll think that some agents do, right? So some of the agents that will be responsible for communities being highly vulnerable are their own government, because their government has a responsibility to protect them that it's not living up to. So Anya Carnine has a paper where she talks about Hurricane Katrina as well, assume for now that Hurricane Katrina was a climate disaster, right? That the hurricane was made more likely or a result of anthropogenic climate change. How should we think about who is responsible for what happened in that case? Not just greenhouse gas emitters. I think Carnine makes the case really persuasively, but the US government completely failed to do what it should have done to protect its citizens. And therefore, particularly if we're talking about compensation as well, right? The responsibility is going to fall on those agencies that had a responsibility to reduce vulnerability. So sometimes those who unjustly contribute are your own government or your own institutions who have either failed to step in and protect you or directly oppressed you and left you marginalized and more vulnerable. Other cases where people could have helped but didn't, we're going to have to answer more difficult questions about what the kind of background responsibilities were and whether in not stepping in and trying to reduce vulnerability, they committed an injustice or not.
Great. So do you think there might be a sense of a scale of responsibility? Say, could those responsible for the social injustices be more or less responsible for action than those responsible for emissions? Or could agents who are potentially responsible in both senses have a greater, more immediate responsibility?
So there are going to be scales, right? But because some people will have contributed much more significantly. Some people, like how unjust their contribution was, will also differ. But I think so that there's going to be scales and degrees of responsibility, but I don't think you're going to get a nice division of responsibility when you see climate change this way. So I explained earlier on in the talk how I think one of the reasons that the PPP is appealing is that it looks like it could divide responsibility for climate change quite neatly. We have the metric of tons of CO2 equivalent, and if we can divvy out the emissions with this common metric, then we can just divvy up the costs of dealing with climate change proportionally. I think that is what some people hope you would be able to do with the PPP, because we have this kind of, we have cumulative emissions that we can measure using a common metric, and then once we parcel them out, we can parcel the costs out. And when we note that it's not actually just a matter of divvying out responsibility for emissions, there are all these other ways in which people and groups contribute to the problem of climate change, like by forcing communities into vulnerable areas, or keeping them poor, or failing to deal with problems of vulnerability that they have a special responsibility to address. how do you compare the kind of responsibility that you have because you forced a community into a dangerous location with the kind of responsibility that you have because you are one of the biggest carbon emitters? It's not so clear that these are going to be commensurable in a way that you can like decide that one contribution is twice as significant as the other. So there will be a scale, but it's going to be there will be scales of degrees of responsibility, but it's not going to be quite so neat. But I think that's kind of what large scale global injustices are like. It's not as if you can kind of neatly quantify your particular responsibility for a complex global injustice. I think climate change looks more like what Iris Marion Young would talk about as a structural injustice. Your responsibility can't be kind of divided up. Everybody who is connected to the injustice in a significant way, for example, by being an unjust contributor to it or by somehow benefiting unjustly from contributions to it, has a remedial responsibility, but maybe not one that can be kind of quantified and compared like as twice as much as somebody else's responsibility. And yeah, some agents will be responsible on multiple grounds. And in a sense, like in a lot of cases, this is probably going to pick out the very same agents, right? Fossil fuel corporations are both significant excessive emitters and therefore remedially responsible on that basis, and also responsible for environmental degradation that leaves communities near extractive facilities highly vulnerable. Various states that have been high historical emitters were also colonizers who have left the places that they colonized highly vulnerable to natural disasters and climate events in various ways. So one thing this does is point to the fact that the agents that we often think of as responsible because they emitted excessively are also responsible for the problem in various other ways. Because climate change is a problem that has been produced both by their emissions and by other stuff that they were doing at the same time, and that is connected to those emissions.
Right, so if the Indigenous community is at a stage where their human rights are not even recognised, how can an outsider work with them to discuss climate change?
I'm not sure if I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question. I think that is an answer for the Indigenous community in question to answer. I'm not in a position to know what the best way to work with that group would be. They would have to tell you themselves.
Fair enough. So moving on to the next question. Right, so it seems to the person asking this question that the problems of vulnerability and exposure can be faced much more locally than the problem of emissions. The state can control their emissions, but the health of their air also depends on how much the other countries emit. For vulnerability and exposure, it seems to me that the solutions may be more local. What are your thoughts about that?
So the actions that you are going to take to reduce emissions, to reduce vulnerability and to reduce exposure will obviously be different in nature. But I don't think that should necessarily change. So let me just look at the question again. State can control their emissions. Yeah, you can have more local solutions to vulnerability and exposure, but not that will entirely succeed in reducing disaster risk, right? You could pour loads of money into trying to reduce vulnerability or in trying to move communities out of harm's way. But if emissions aren't also controlled, that's not going to be enough to stop communities from facing disaster, right? You can only enhance resilience so much or reduce vulnerability so much. If climate events if climate change is left unchecked, that's not going to be enough to stop communities facing disaster risk. So this, yeah. So I guess that's my thoughts about the question.
Great. So do you think this investigation, so your work on who contributed unjustly to vulnerability, is going to give very different results than investigations about the polluter pays and the beneficiary pays? So, for example, isn't it often the same people who increase the vulnerability of the community and who contributed to increase the probability of terrible climate events? So thinking here, big companies, negligent governments, etc.
Yeah, so yeah, in a lot of cases, it is going to be the same parties who have both contributed to emissions and contributed to vulnerability and exposure. But I think it's, so in a sense, I'm not trying to assign remedial responsibility to different agents than you would probably be assigning it to using the PPP and the BPP. I think it's still important to recognize what grounds those responsibilities. So it isn't just a fact that these groups have emitted, and they can't try to wriggle off the hook just by trying to excuse their emissions. These parties also have responsibilities for the other stuff that they've been doing. And I think if we really want to understand the problem of climate change, it's important to recognize the other things that many of these parties have been doing. I mean, for one thing, it does change things in the sense that you might have particular relationships of responsibility. So emissions, one country's emissions don't cause direct harm to any other particular community, right? The emissions go into the atmosphere, and it's the overall increase in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations that then has the result of dangerous climate events occurring. So you can't pin any particular harms on any particular emitters because of their emissions. But if we're looking at the ways in which certain parties have contributed to exposure and vulnerability, there will be those direct relationships of responsibility, right? So Henry Shue, who's going to be speaking later in this series, in a paper that I'm a big fan of called The Unavoidability of Justice, that he actually wrote, I think, in 1992, raises the example of like France and Haiti, and this question of whether there might be a particular relationship of responsibility there when it comes to thinking about, like, well, he raises the question, well, some of the resources that Haiti should be able to use to deal with the problem of climate change are probably in France, right? And if that's the case, then we not only have another grounds on which certain countries have responsibilities for dealing with the problem of climate change, but they're responsibilities they owe to particular others, not just responsibilities they have as a kind of general duty to help clean up this collective problem.
Great. So we've got a question here that your point is really convincing, but what would you say to people who might say something like, it's not time anymore to fight about who's responsible. We just must think about taking everyone on board with a collective project and only mobilize energy into finding solutions. So I guess people who might be more prone to thinking about the ability to pay principle.
Yeah. So I sometimes think that where I'm going to end up is actually a kind of, might end up concluding that ability to pay is the best way to go, partly because, well, so you might hope it's a more practical solution. Actually, it's not that practical because the wealthy don't want to pay, and you need to find a way of making them do so. So I think, right, this idea that there is a collective solution that everyone could get behind is wrong. There isn't. So you can't avoid these discussions about responsibility. They're inevitable because right, one of the reasons we have not managed to deal with climate change yet is that there isn't a solution that everyone can get behind. And often the reason is because those solutions that are proposed look really unfair. Well, partly because for some people it's because they look unfair, because they are unfair, and for others it's because it requires them to make good on the damage that they've been doing and rein in their profligate greenhouse gas emissions, and they don't want to. So I don't think there is a straightforward way. I can see why you might think that the approach that I'm motivating just makes things seem more complicated. I mean, if you think that we just need to put complications aside and try and come up with the fairest looking solution that could be rolled out with the right kind of urgency, I can see why you might go for something like ability to pay. But I would hope that my approach still gives some kind of extra justification for ability to pay, because you can say, well, actually, it's not just that you have the most capacity. In a lot of cases, those with the most capacity have the most capacity because they've been, they are the ones that have committed various injustices and benefited from various injustices throughout history, who have been benefiting from very high emissions, even when they knew the problem that they were contributing to and haven't stopped. So I guess if you were keen for just, right, we just need to deal with this problem now, maybe you would go with ability to pay, but the picture that I'm trying to present here explains a bit as to why some of those who are able to pay, they also have a responsibility to pay because they've contributed unjustly to this problem.
So this next question is coming from someone, I think from a bit more of a policy area. So given what you've said about excessive emitters, what do you think about the policy idea of personal carbon budgets or personal carbon allowances? And a second part to that question, do you have any ideas for practical, politically feasible policies to encourage excessive emitters or contributors to pay for their contribution?
So I'm not that good at policy. My focus is generally philosophy, and some philosophers are really, really good at doing policy stuff, but I'm not so great, because I think it's really hard to know what would actually work. So I can say something about what a fair approach to dealing with climate change would look like, or ways in which approaches to dealing with climate change are really unjust, but I can't tell you what will work in trying to make things better. I don't particularly like the idea of personal carbon budgets or personal carbon allowances, because I don't think this is an individual problem. So like I said, emissions result from these really, really complex social practices with long supply chains, where it's really difficult as an individual to try and change much about that, right? What needs to happen is we need to stop fossil fuels getting dug up out of the ground and refined and burned. We need to reduce consumption massively, not just individually. So I think personal carbon budgets sometimes seem to place responsibility in the wrong place and distract from the fact that this is an institutional, structural problem, right? It's big carbon emitters and states that have the capacity to do something about this. Not so much individuals, except in their ability to collectivize, to put pressure on those institutions to change the way that they act. So in terms of practical, politically feasible policies, I mean, you need to get the agents with power to implement those policies. And I think maybe the best bet we have for that right now is collective action. But it's hard to know whether it's going to work or not, because the power imbalances are really, really entrenched.
Great. So I wanted to ask you about, push more on your point on natural disasters. So you, as I understood it, you distinguish them from anthropogenic climate change, something which is human caused, as opposed to a natural disaster like a tsunami or earthquake, which is not human induced. And I wondered what you might say to the following idea, the idea that you could say that natural disasters are in a way caused by human activity. So humans might choose to set up their communities, their cities in areas that are particularly prone, such as, around a volcano. I'm thinking Pompeii, but there are many other examples. A more recent example is an Australian example, the New South Wales government wanting to build more communities in the Hawkesbury area, which is a flood-prone area. And specifically, they intend to raise the Warragamba Dam to do that. You might say that in that case, building there is a human choice, and would make them more vulnerable. So they're playing into natural disasters. I wonder what you might say about that.
Yeah, so I would just agree. So that's one of the things that I think. So one of the reasons why looking at natural disasters is helpful, I think. So when I teach climate justice, I sometimes ask my students to try and attempt at least a thought experiment where you imagine that climate change was not actually anthropogenic, and then try to think about in what ways that would change the normative dimensions of the problems, right? Obviously, this is a philosophical thought experiment based on a falsehood, right? Climate change is anthropogenic. It's a human-caused phenomenon. But would we, if it wasn't human-caused, right? Imagine fossil fuels around the world were just kind of spontaneously combusting or something. Would that mean that because we now don't have polluters or beneficiaries of pollution, the only grounds on which to assign responsibilities would be something like ability to pay? That doesn't seem correct to me, right? Because there are lots of, first of all, there are lots of other ways in which particular agencies have special responsibilities towards particular communities, right? So we would still want to know if your government has done a good enough job in protecting you from natural climate change. But also, like you say, the impacts of natural disasters are filtered through the social situation, the underlying social situation that they interact with, which means that the same volcanic eruption or earthquake will have very different impact depending on whether the community that it affects has resilient infrastructure and is prepared, or has been left vulnerable by some kind of agent. Similarly, like you say, we might think that if there is a flood in that location in Australia that you mentioned, when the government built there knowing full well that floods were highly likely, even if those floods were a product of human-induced climate change, we might not think it's emitters that have the kind of the most significant responsibility to help that community, but the government that built their houses there in full knowledge that climate change probably meant they were going to be flooded. So yeah, I would want to say, like, thinking about natural disasters helps, because if we are not focusing on the human agency aspect that has contributed to the events themselves, like it does in the climate change case, we just think about events that are geological, like that people haven't caused. I think it helps us notice the other sources of human agency that are often at play when natural events result in human disasters.
Great. So this next question is about if people are aware now of how they're doing damage and causing harm, would they have a responsibility to halt that if that would entail a destructive intervention? So perhaps another way of thinking about that, if I've got this question right, is suppose you've got a community in a vulnerable area, such as an island nation, which is prone to flooding and sea level rise. Is the only way to address the vulnerability there to move these people? So you might address the vulnerability by moving them to, let's say, an apartment block somewhere in Middle America or in the UK. That would address all the vulnerabilities, but that would also, would it not give rise to more injustices? So rather than just choosing to mitigate climate change now and reduce that sea level rise?
Okay. Yeah, so that, okay, so I think there's two things going on in this question maybe. So some ways in which you might try to reduce exposure or reduce vulnerability would be harmful, right? And that, first of all, shows how it's really, really important that the communities in question are involved in saying how they are willing to adapt to climate change, and whether they are willing to just be moved out of harm's way, which I think is sometimes offered as a solution because it's the cheapest option. Like some communities do want to move, but they can't because they haven't got the resources, right? But so it's important to make sure that the community is involved, because otherwise you policymakers might think that they're helping when actually they're just making things worse. But this also raises the question, right? What is the right approach to trying to reduce the risk that communities are subjected to? Like I said, there's the kind of the three options that are generally given: mitigation, adaptation, compensation. And we might think that some forms of adaptation are actually going to result in other kinds of injustice for communities, right? Relocation would be the big example. Even if relocation might be the most surefire way of making sure a community isn't hit by a climate event, there might be reasons why, well, some groups claim that being relocated would actually be even worse than being hit by a climate disaster, because it is so important for them to stay to the land that they are connected to. So in that case, right, even if maybe you're responsible for the group being vulnerable or being there in the first place, it might be that the way that you make good on your responsibility is by putting all of your effort into mitigating climate change, because that is the only response to the problem that doesn't result in more injustice. So even if the reason that you're on the hook for remedial responsibility, right, is that you contributed to that group's vulnerability, it's not that you're an emitter, or you contributed to that group's exposure. It might be that what you need to do right now, if this is what the group wants, is work really hard to mitigate climate change, because that's the only kind of acceptable solution they see to the problem that they're now facing. The question also asks about the ethics of inaction, and whether if you know about the mechanisms of damage, you have a responsibility. I mean, lots of people would say yes, right? Anyone with the capacity to try and remedy the problem of climate change in some way might have some kind of responsibility for dealing with it. But your responsibility would have a different ground than, so it would be of a different nature, right? So like I said, we can have remedial responsibilities in lots of different ways. One way, which seems to be I think some people think is a more kind of solid way because of the way it connects you to the problem, is that you have contributed to it, and particularly if you've contributed to it in an unjust way. Capacity is another ground, and depending on maybe if your capacity is much, much greater than the contributor, we'd think actually you're the person that should step in and remedy the problem. In other cases, it might be quite difficult to compare your responsibilities, but like I said, these responsibilities are not going to be ones that can kind of be divided up or quantified, I don't think. So yes, people with the capacity probably do also have a responsibility, but how that kind of responsibility compares to those who have contributed, it's a different kind of responsibility, and it's not easy to see exactly how they weigh up against one another.
Great, so we've got a question here now with a bit of a concrete example. So do you have any thoughts on how to identify the responsible agent for vulnerability? The following example, so take Alexandria in Egypt, which is very highly exposed to sea level rise. Both international and Egyptian scientists have underlined the government should build seawalls and warning systems, but the Sisi government doesn't, and very roughly, rather uses the money granted by the International Monetary Fund to build a brand new town in a desert. Who is responsible for Alexandria's vulnerability in this case? It seems to be Sisi, but perhaps, and forgive me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, but perhaps you can go further on the chain and say it's because of who contributed to Sisi becoming president, or go lower in the chain and rather say it's about the governor of Alexandria's region who does not defend its interests enough?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is isn't a good example of the really difficult questions that you get when we try to think about complex global injustices, of which climate change is like a really, really difficult case because there are so many different factors that have contributed. So what we're looking for is unjust contributors, right? So the Sisi government, if what you say is correct, well, okay, so the question needs to be, they appear to, right, your government, let's say, quite plausibly is responsible for protecting its citizens, right? At least within the realms of its capacity. Some governments do not have the capacity to protect their citizens from climate change because they have been impacted by these historical injustices. And then we would, I think, rather than saying, well, it's the government that has a remedial responsibility here, we'd want to say that like other agents in the international community have a responsibility here, either because they have better capacity or because they've contributed to the fact that the government can't step in and protect the citizens itself. So the questions you'd want to ask in a case like this, which are going to be difficult questions, right? I'm not saying this is easy, but like, does the government have the capacity to protect its citizens here, and it's just choosing to do something else because it has a vanity project that it would rather spend money on? So like, we need to know if this new town in the desert is important enough to justify spending the money there instead. There are then these difficult questions of, well, when we hold governments responsible for failing to protect their citizens or for other problems that they create, to what extent does that fall back on the citizenry themselves? And then we want to know answers to questions like, well, how democratic is that government? In how plausible is it to say that as a citizen, you share in some responsibility for what your government is doing? That's going to partly depend on how representative and just your government is, whether you voted for them, whether you support them, whether there's some other kind of way in which you are implicated in what your government is doing. But yeah, so I think this is just a good demonstration of the fact that there are going to be lots of people who contribute, and trying to determine who contributes in a way that can be kind of faulted and therefore gives rise to responsibility is going to be difficult, but that doesn't mean that that's just something that we have to try and do if we really want to try and figure out how we should think about responsibility for this problem.
Great. So we're coming, or we've reached the end of all the questions on the live chat. I have one final question, and if anyone has a final thought, please do post it on the chat, and we'll try to get to it. But so, as I understand it, you've been suggesting this vulnerability view in addition to the polluter pays principle. So they're seen as complementary, as I understand.
Yeah.
And I wondered what you thought about the following idea. So sometimes when you look at causation, you come across the principle of intervening agents. So the idea that, I might do some wrong, I might, negligently hit someone with my car, that person is taken to hospital. And then a doctor at the hospital might do the surgery wrong. So they kind of intervene, they intercept my action. And you can say that the causal chain between my original harm and the harm done to the victim is broken by that agent. And I wonder what you might say about the following. So imagine that, these governments might withhold from making their communities more resilient to climate harms. So they stop funding, as in the Alexandria case, they don't divert the money to building seawalls. Could that act be seen as them intervening and breaking the chain between original emitters and the resultant climate harms.
So the idea would be that the full responsibility gets placed on the government because...
Exactly, yeah.
So I guess you're assuming in that case that the government could have completely stopped, that if the government had stepped in, they could have stopped any harm from taking place. But you might still think that isn't a case of intervening agency that totally gets emitters off the hook, because the government wouldn't have had to lay out that expense to protect its citizens if climate change hadn't been a challenge that it was facing. I think you are maybe going to get challenges about intervening agency if you think of cases like so like imagine cases where islands are actually going to be completely submerged by sea level rise. So it's not that this isn't a case where this might not be a case where you think actually the harm done also depended on how vulnerable that community was, right? Because no matter how many resources the community had, it wouldn't have been possible to stop the island from being submerged. So I think that might look like a case where the emissions sort of dominate as being the major cause. And I think partly because these like so-called sinking island cases have been really prominent in the philosophical literature, that might support this idea that emissions are the real cause that we should be worried about when we're thinking about responsibility for climate change. But I don't think there's going to be lots of cases where that doesn't happen and where the costs really are a product of both climate change and the underlying social situation as both being crucial contributors, right? It's not that one cuts off the causal agency of the other. The harms that materialize because of the interaction of both, and that happens in small island cases as well, right? So again, quite a lot of small islands are cases where there's lots of cases where settlements are on the coast because of past colonial decision making, or where like I think Nauru, the middle of Nauru was completely strip mined by phosphate mining, which is one of the reasons why it has high vulnerability to the problem of climate change. So there will be maybe extreme cases where it seems like emissions are the dominant cause, or maybe where vulnerability seems like it's the dominant cause because actually the climate event itself, although it was a result of climate change, it was a kind of mild climate event that most communities would have been able to deal with if they weren't suffering from extremely high vulnerability. But I think most of the cases are going to be in between, where we're really talking about harms that are co-produced by both atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations increasing and resulting in changes to the climate and the underlying situation they interact with in such a way that it's going to be, I don't see how you can then kind of assign harms like as being the product of the emissions and harms as being the product of the social situation. They're produced by them working in tandem.
Great. So I think we have time for just one more question. And this is about, so shouldn't a global problem require global governance? So I guess rather a big question, but maybe a grandiose one to end on.
I mean, it depends what you mean by global governance. The difficulty with global governance is that it can be just as open to problems of procedural injustice and marginalization, maybe even more so than any form of governance, right? So we need to have a very hard think about exactly what global governance would look like if it wasn't to reproduce quite a lot of the problems that other kinds of governance have been producing across time. So how do you make global governance representative of the voices of everybody, including the most vulnerable, and not just representative of like kind of the existing power holders that already have a huge say over what's happening? So I guess my answer is it depends what that global governance looks like. I guess if it looked the right way, then it could make things better, but if it looks the wrong way, then it's going to make things worse.
Great. Well, Megan, I think that's all we have time for. And I wanted to thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was really fantastic, and I think everyone watching did too. And I want to give special thanks to everyone in the audience who posted a question. I think that I got to all of them, and apologies if I missed any. Next week, we're going to have Henry Shue join us, who Megan mentioned in her talk. He'll be speaking with us about second chances in climate change, so carbon dioxide removal and intergenerational risk transfer. And I highly encourage anyone to register for that event or just join us back here at 2 p.m. On June 17, I think it is. Great. Well, thanks, Megan. Thanks, everyone. And see you in 2 weeks' time.